Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves and today we are returning to our series of podcasts about the housing crisis. Remember folks, the Echo Chamber podcast is a free-flowing conversation that may occasionally touch on mature subjects. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Martin McMahon, or as he's soon to be known, Mad Martin McMahon.
No, I don't think so, Tony. Don't say that.
More importantly, we're delighted to be joined in the Tortoise Shack by architect, project manager, certified passive house designer, writer with Village magazine. He contributes to, is it Passive House?
Passive House Plus, yeah.
Yeah. Mel Reynolds. Mel has the tenacity to take on to actually read the Department of Housing reports, the Rebuilding Ireland reports, even the Oireachtas Housing Reports. He reads them, cuts through the spin and gets to the facts. Needless to say, Mel's work is and should be one of the starting points for people who want to know what the real numbers are and what way we can work towards getting good solutions. Mel, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks a lot. Nice intro. Hope I can live up to it.
Listen, I've been a bit of a. I know I've been on to you trying to get you on, but we really did because I think it was about 3 or 4 months ago, Mel. I did an article based on more or less one of your. I gave a narrative to one of your reports, and I remember at the time getting people jumping up and down on the online commenters came in and hammered me with government statistics, and you were able to produce the actual Department of Housing stat that showed
the source documents, yeah.
Yeah, and when you produced the source documents, it all went quiet online, and forever, ever in your debt now, as I see it,
But pretty much everybody we've spoken to previously said that we had to get you in here and talk about housing. Everybody said it. Everybody we spoke to, you've got to get Mel.
That's a bit scary. If we're at this now, I think we're in.
They did, and everybody said you are just impartial. It's data driven. That's the way you look at this. It's completely data driven. You're not taking anybody's side. You're not trying to promote a point of view. You're just basically working with the data that exists.
Sure, yeah. Well, that's the way you have to do it. You have to try and do it. Yeah.
That's what everybody said, and I think that's why your voice on this subject is very respected on this subject. People see that you don't have a bias either way. So thanks very much for coming in. I'm delighted to have you in here.
Don't disappoint you now here.
Martin, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about assumptions, and you've written, or you're in the process of writing something about assumptions, and will you tell us the assumptions that everybody has that are underlying the property market and that everybody's way off?
Yeah, well, I suppose my background isn't in policy analysis or statistical analysis. I would have done quite a bit of work in speculative sector, a lot of work in speculative residential sector as well. So, as well in terms of social housing, homelessness, those sort of social issues wouldn't be my bag. It would be pure development and making something stack up. So, if you had a site, if you came into me, I would be the guy who would be brought in to work out what's the best use on the site, what's the one that gives you the best return on it, how to design it, best pathway to procurement, etc. So that's sort of my thing. So in terms of objective advice, you need to know what's going on. You need to have a clear view of what's going on. You need to, like, for example, if you were to say to me, okay, we want to do X building type, I want to know how many are being built, what's the cost of building it, what's coming down the tracks, and is there any policy coming at us that might affect you one way or another. So in order to be able to give clients a clear view of what's happening, you need to know what's going on yourself. And the difficulty there is to try and get past the sort of unconscious bias that we all have on certain things and certain policies. But I suppose probably around this time last year, a little bit earlier, I started asking a few very simple, some people call naive questions about some of the base assumptions about policy. And one of them, fundamental ones, if you Google it, you'll see hundreds of entries, is does increasing supply, new home supply, reduce price? And this, not only in Ireland, but in London, I heard it recently, the States, Australia as well, this is a pretty basic assumption. Now, when you go off and look at the information, like the CSO website has information on new home prices and new home supply levels, completion levels for the last 40 years since 1975, plot them on an Excel document, work out the correlation, you'll find out that increasing supply has never reduced price in 40 years
And
in Ireland. It hasn't done it. And in actual fact, the strongest correlation, this is working with an actuary because I'm terrible on Excel, but there's a pretty strong correlation between price leading supply by about 12 months. So, and we're seeing that at the moment. Now, from my own point of view, I can look back at my own experience and say, yeah, actually, that makes sense when I think about it, because when prices level off or drop a little bit, builders stop on site, they'll stop a phase, they'll wait. We've had builders waiting for 7-8 years, and some sites have been dormant for 10 years. Were started maybe 2006, 2007, and when builders realised what was going on, they stopped the next phases. So that's what happens. And I suppose, you know, throughout my career, construction has always been cyclical. You talk to anybody who grew up in the 70s, they tell you about prices trebling in 3 years. The late 70s, 80s were flat, 90s it started to kick off again. We had a flattening out in 2002, but we joined the euro, so prices started turbocharging again, and then we had this artificial inflation. Then we should have had a little bump in 2002, and we didn't. And then we had the bang.
Interest rates as well.
And the low interest rates did it. So, you know, there are for example, interest rates, there's a correlation between bank interest rates and prices of about 0.76. So there's other factors feeding into increasing supply, like demographics, net internal migration. It's far more complex. But if you're to look at that one assumption that increasing supply will reduce price, is not correct. And there is a correlation between the two, but it's the reverse of what we think.
But that would have been that is a basic tenet for pretty much everybody in politics at the moment, that supply increase the supply and demand eases off. That's
well, it's a fundamental one when you look at it. It's not based. There's no factual basis for it.
You had a different phrase for this.
What was that? It was.
What was the phrase about facts that aren't facts?
Oh, stylised facts. Yeah, that's I borrowed that from John McCarthy and Savills. That's a great phrase that he had, where you have these sort of basic assumptions that when you look at them or interrogate them may or may not be correct. And to be honest with you, in the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of assumptions I would have been pretty involved in the sector were either wrong or seriously challenged when you start looking at the information properly.
But supposedly the data all exists. It's just that nobody's plucking in or taking in the right data and doing the right analysis on the data. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, I think so. And I suppose part of it is you ask the question and then you go into the long grass. If you start wandering through the grass without a target or a question, you'll get lost pretty quickly. And frequently, you know, looking at certain items, I would have missed things that were right in front of me in terms of, you know, for example, Part 5 completions, social housing outputs, acquisitions, all these sort of other numbers that are pretty critical are out there, ones you know what to look for. And I suppose one question would be, how many social houses from all sources did we have last year? That's a pretty simple question. Then it's a bit of where do you get the information? Can you double check it? Usually you try, excuse me, CSO is the best source really of information. And the department itself. Now sometimes you get competing data sets as well, which would be I don't think intentional, but you know, numbers can change slightly from department to department. So that's where it comes out, is where do you find the stuff and how do you actually extract it from all the other noise that's out there.
That's been you know, because I remember we've spoken to other people, and I've spoken to other people offline. I think it was one of the famous ones that between the jigs and the reels was that at one stage the department had produced more plans last year than they had actually built social houses.
That's right. Yeah, more announcements. I think 64, and at that stage there was less houses built.
Yeah, I think at that stage we'd only 55 or whatever it was, and I remember that was one of the statistics that was just the most. The mind boggled, because at the time they were actually reporting close to 4,000, I think was what they were actually telling the public. Yet in terms of producers, we go back and we talk about it was ESB connections. Now we're getting muddled on commencement notices. We're getting it's kind of it's another
Well, the two, I mean, there's about maybe 14 separate indicators of activity. There are 3 that are reliable, that aren't focused on by officials, and as the rest of them are either There's no correlation between that and supply, or they're inflationary.
Right.
Even using the ESB connections, ESB MPRNs is your meter number.
Yeah.
If you're, I think you might have other people on have mentioned this as well. I mean, if you've had a house that's been vacant for 2 years or longer, safety protocol in the ESB requires you to get it checked out and to get a new MPRN number. So the old one is cancelled and you get a new number. Nothing physically happens. But of course, if you're counting MPRN numbers, which are connections, as new bills, we've had something like 32,000 houses of that type have been brought back into stock in since 2010.
Yeah.
So we believe we've overstated the number by 32,000. So it's mad, and that figure 32,000 comes from the department's own vacant ghost estate report, which was brought out last year. So the other thing is, if you were to get onto the ESB and ask them how many disconnections has there been, or how many MPRN cancellations has there been, you get the other side of it. And last year there was around about 13,000 disconnections.
And they're not even, obviously.
They're not reported. So even if you were to use the ESB MPRNs as an indicator, you take the new connections or the new numbers and you subtract the cancellations. Last year it was 15,000, this year it was 13. So your net additional numbers based on that should be around 2,000.
It's crazy.
So that's the wrong one. Commencements, the other thing, sorry, just very briefly on commencements. Multi-unit commencements, you could put in a commencement notice for 400 units and build them out over 5 years. You could put in a commencement notice and not build. A lot of commencement notices were put in 07 or 08 that are still active, that haven't been finished out. So a commencement notice, when you look at the information, is it's an indication of activity, commencement notice activity, but not completions. So planning permissions, likewise, currently the level of planning permissions at the moment, I think the last information that was brought out, I just checked it against 2006, and we have 80% of the planning permissions now that we had in 2006.
Right.
But in 2006, we're building 90,000 houses, and we're building maybe 9,000 this year. And when you look at the planning permission levels over the past 12 years, they vary hugely. There's no correlation whatsoever. So the two areas, ironically, the best indicator for completions is actually completions. And we have a register of completions called the BCMS, which is out there. You can try and go through it. It's very hard to get information out of it, but we don't get totals. And we know the total for BCMS completions for last year, I think from memory, is about 2,000 or 2,100.
Yeah.
So these were houses that would have started from March 2014 onwards and have been completed last year. So, completions, it's the clue is in the title.
You measure outputs.
But even taking it on a wider scale, just beyond social housing, this policy fog, and you've called it a policy fog, about how we can't get to the numbers, or how it takes you to cut through the long grass to get through any of the numbers. But on the houses that are being built, they're being built for a specific income group. They're not being built where they're needed most. They're being built for the higher earners. Am I right in saying that?
That's just a feature of the market at the moment, is that somewhere in the region of 74% of all new developments are in Dublin, 94% of apartments are in Dublin, and they're all geared at the top 20% of earners. And that's really just a factor of, if you were given a site for free, and if you were tasked with building, developing and selling an apartment as a private developer, it probably cost you about €295,000, which is for a 2-bed. That's assuming the site's about 35. There's no sites available in Dublin that I'm aware of for 35. They're all around 60 or 70. So the affordable level for a house is 3.5 times the average income. Average income for a household, if you were to put it maximum out of one full-time and one part-time salary, that gives you an affordable level of 240,000. So straight away, the private sector, that the private sector cannot deliver affordable housing, because that model of building, which is a private individual getting a site for free, developing with a profit margin that's needed for financing of 20%, can't deliver. Straight away, you're over the affordable housing maximum limit. So the model of procurement that we have here, which is the private sector development model, cannot provide affordable housing.
But that's a double whammy then on the assumptions. The assumption is that if you build more houses, you're going to take the pressure off the whole way down the chain. But in fact, what they are building at the moment is not taking, it's actually increasing pressure on the chain below. It's the top 20% that are moving, but nothing else.
Well, it's hard to know, but certainly the type of, you'd need to know what sort of jobs are moving into Ireland. They're probably higher paid IT jobs seem to be targeted at the moment. They're not going to be renting a one bed, for €1,000 out in County Dublin. They're going to want to be in the middle of town,
City centre. Yeah.
They're this myth about the sort of Google worker, the sort of transient IT worker that's poor, disenfranchised by the housing sector. I think the average salary in Google is something like €97,000 a year. So that's the average full-time wage is 45. So, a Google worker can afford to pay €2,000 or €2,500 a month may not like it, but they can well afford to pay it, whereas an average worker here can't.
But you were saying too that on the assumption, the price assumption, that doesn't just apply to bills, that also applies to rents, that if you increase the supply...
Oh yeah, of course, yeah, because your yield there, the minimum yield is around 5% at the moment, so it's very simple, just 1/20th of whatever the price is will give you a rental level. So if you're selling if you, as an investor, if you were to buy a €500,000 two-bed in town in the docks, if you want to rent it, you want to get us 5% rent out of it, which is $2,000, a little bit over $2,000 a month. That's what you want to rent it. And at the moment, because we've such we've a knife edge of supply, it's been called, where we've got 1,300 available rentals in Dublin, something like 10% of what it should be. It's really a landlord's market at the moment, and a lot of the new builds can really place their rents at whatever level they want. So that's what's driving prices now as well.
When you say that it's a landlord's market, landlords is not that plural in that context. The landscape of who's renting out property in this country has changed enormously. And am I right that one company, on the planning, it has changed enormously? Sorry, Tony, I'm after going down
You're all right.
Tangent on that one.
No, you're right. You're not wrong, because what you're saying as well, though, is actually fair, because a lot of our landscape, and even when you listen to the guys in the Construction Industry Federation, they talk about the landlords of the future being the REITs, the Hibernias, and that's what they talk about. They don't talk about it being, remember the day the guard, the teacher that had houses along the North Circular and South Circular Road. Those days are in the rearview mirror for some, and most, actually a good tranche of it is going to be what they're going to call a professional landlord class, whereas which are funds, which are like a lot of them are managed funds.
The interesting thing about that is that the build to let market really hasn't taken off yet. No. There's an awful lot in the media about it, but the standard new landlord profile is somebody who's buying, 60% of new landlords, as from memory, are buying with cash. So they've no loan, so any measures there regarding mortgage interest relief don't affect them, and they're buying one property. So the number of buy-to-lets we have at the moment, you could nearly count on one hand. Despite all the noise about it, we have, I think Kennedy Wilson did a scheme up in Island Bridge of about 300 units. Yeah. We've got a NAMA-funded scheme out in Honey Park was sold, 200 and odd units were sold at an average price of about 360,000 2 years ago. They're built out and rented now. There's a lot of noise about the build to rents, and they probably will come in, but as a percentage of overall stock, if you take, we've got 2 million houses. Yeah, it's a tiny market. The interesting thing about build to rent was I was asked to talk about Rebuilding Ireland the day before it came out 18 months ago. Right. And I decided to give AIB Bank Centre a call, which is my bank. It just coincidentally is my local bank, or my original bank. So I gave them a call, and I went through the various different hurdles on the phone, and I said, what's the story about development finance? And I finally got through to a very nice person on the phone in Bank Centre, and I said, they said to me, is it to build to live in yourself or to rent? I said, build to rent. They said, we don't do it. Just flat out, no, we don't do build to rent. And that's my understanding that that's still the case. That
it's very small.
It's very small. So
and the appetite is even smaller, and if you can then afford to, the price, the margin is a lot less attractive. It's not. So it's all designed there, as you said. There's cash buyers who can go in and buy a standalone house, and that's. But
this isn't even for. Sorry, Tony. This isn't even for investors. This is if you have a site. Can I get finance to build it out? Build to rent? No. That was it. So the next day when Rebuilding Ireland was launched, there's this whole chapter on build to rent, and I remember saying, listen, this is just a waste of time because it's not there. There's no finance there for it. Similarly, if you want to talk about social engineering and getting people, older people who are in bigger houses into smaller ones, there's a mistaken assumption there that the smaller units that they'll be going into will be small one beds. I don't know any older couple who want to move into something that's that small. They'll want to have a big place for their big furniture. They'll want to be a very spacious 2-bed or a 3-bed. That's the model that a lot of people are building at the moment. But if you're an older person and if you want to trade down, your first hurdle will be bridging finance for your deposit because you can't get it. The banks aren't giving out bridging finance. So it doesn't matter how many discussions are on the radio about this particular policy. It ain't going to happen because the bridging finance isn't there.
You've shown us actually that there is some activity going on in the property market, but it's going on predominantly in the top end of the property market. And the need that's most at the moment is for first-time buyers. So where do first-time buyers stand at the moment with the property market the way it is?
Well, the first-time buyers are, I think, the sort of populist end of it. They're the one that everyone sort of focuses in on. But the reality of it is, I think last year there was something like around about 50,000 stamp duty transactions, sales of houses. Out of that, about 7,000 were first-time. Sorry, this is in 2016. 7,000 were first-time buyers, but out of that, there's only around 900 odd were first-time buyers of new homes. So there's a really, really small percentage. I think I spotted this. Daniel McLaughlin had tweeted this actually on Twitter, and something like 2% of the market were first-time buyers. And I went off and I got his links and checked out the CSO, and he was correct. So it's a really small sector of the market. Then we had the pro-cyclical, I call it the first-time buyers grant, which is the old phrase for it. That was removed, I think, in 2004 because it was seen to be
overheating
the market, and just went straight into, it was all the pejoratives that went in straight into developers' pockets, etc. But it was an inflationary measure that was brought in, and now we've seen the first-time buyer activity increase. Now it's 5%, but it's still very low out of the total number of transactions. And I think the number of new build transactions for 2017 are only up by about 600 on 2016.
Oh, that's very
the last time I looked at it, which was about 2 weeks ago, it hasn't increased that much in comparison with 2016. Now, the one thing that could be masking that is the fact that if you're a developer and if you'd been mothballed in Nama for the last 7 years, if you had a scheme like Central Park in Leopardstown, a lot of your listeners will probably see it from the M50. They were completed in about, I think, 2008, 2009, vacant for years. These would have been double counted as completions then when they're re-inhabited a couple of years later. If the scheme is still in the ownership of the original developer, it's counted as a new stamp duty transaction for the purposes of tax. So if title hasn't transferred, so if you're still a developer on life support in Nama, if you now sell to a Tony last year and the unit has been built 7 or 8 years and vacant, it's still considered for stamp duty purposes as a new house. So this sort of wave of existing vacant ghost to say completed units is distorting the figures in some respect. So the new stamp duty transactions is a really good one to look at in terms of the activity in the market, what's coming for sale or to rent commercially. But the best indicator is probably to be your figures, and they, since 2013, has been a legal requirement for all houses to have a BER cert on completion. So they're the best indicator of overall activity.
We've heard a lot about land banks and how land banks are preventing
Rent seeking.
Well, yeah, Tony calls this rent seeking. Tony, explain the rent seeking concept.
Well, rent seeking is when you don't increase any, you create no new wealth while actually just increasing your size of the wealth that's in the pot. So it's literally sitting on it, depressing. You can depress supply. That brings up the value of what you're actually sitting on, and then actually release it in, and you get more for less. Lots of markets use it as in particularly where you have collusion, or you have these kind of where these things can actually be done, and it's easily done. It's without in a market that's coming off its knees as well. So it made sense in some parts where you could get an acre a few years back for 11,500, and and there you could buy these sites. And we look at sites like Cherrywood and these new developments that go up, and you know the land price from where it was on its knees to where it is today.
Sure, yeah.
And the difference there. So land hoarding, and especially in a market where the state have, I think the vacant land tax is due around 2020, I think is what the plan is.
2019, I think it's going.
Yeah, but I don't think it's payable till 2020.
Yeah, it's kicked out. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you have it in that market, there's no penalty to actually to do it. You know.
No, it's very weak. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, I think I was saying a little bit earlier, that the sort of a critical number, which is very interesting interpreting the way that the market has gone at the moment. And it's the counterintuitive idea that how can somebody hold on to land and not build on it and get value out of it? But it's very interesting. Basically, for every 10% increase in the sales price of a new house, land value increases by around about 30%.
That's staggering.
And this is that's just sort of a factor of the market. And this is, you have this sort of leverage. The house prices may go up and down, but land prices have much bigger swings up and down. Now the reverse is true. If new house prices drop by 10%, land values will drop by 30%, and that's why we had sites that people paid, the glass bottle site. People, what was it, 350 million, and then 5 years later it was worth 10.
Yeah.
So this is because you have this thing, because most of your costs, if you say, for example, if you buy a site for €30,000, it costs you 150,000 to build your unit. Add on all your bits and pieces and your VAT at 40, the tax is only 17% and not 50%, as some people have suggested.
Yeah.
You end up on your profit margin at 20%, you're at around 330,000. If you drop, most of your costs there are fixed, VAT will go up or down slightly. But if you drop your sales price by 30,000, all of a sudden your land value is down at 5, because your profit is the same, all your other input prices are the same. So similarly, if the sales price goes up by 30,
Your land.
you're laughing because your site price is nearly doubled. And this is why we've gotten, for the lucky people who had cash and bought in 2013 or 2014, the value of land has probably gone up by between 200 and 300%.
Since in that short space of time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at Cherrywood, I'm familiar with it because I live nearby, but Cherrywood, I think the site value there was somewhere in the region of 27,000 when it was sold at the end of 2013. Site values now, Monkstown Farm, there's a site for sale for 120,000 a site.
Yeah.
And Monkstown Farm wouldn't be a very, it's an ordinary area. It isn't sort of, a posh area. So your site value, if you can sell a two-bed apartment for 460 or 480 in Cherrywood, which you should be able to do, your site value there will be about 120,000. So you've seen the site values going up by 100% a year in these locations. Now, if we had an economic crash or a hiccup or whatever happened now, and if prices dropped from 480 to 400, your sites would be back down at worth of 40 or 50,000.
But in the market, the way it exists, a 300% increase in that's in any other sector.
Martin is looking very shocked over there.
Martin's looking to buy a site quick, but I think you're.
But you'd say there's something wrong in any other sector where you're seeing that kind of growth.
Well, it is, but it's sort of, this is the casino, this is the land casino that you were talking about, where you have, development is deceptively simple. It starts off at your sales price, you take off your costs, you build in a minimum profit of 20%, and then you end up with what's called a residual value, which is the lump you're left with is the value of your site, residual site value, and that's what it should be. But unfortunately, at the moment, when you look in town, sites are exchanging money, for 120, 130,000, and sales prices, you can buy second-hand units for anywhere between 250 and 300. So in that instance, you have, if you're to build out residential, you'd lose money, but other uses are more valuable for your site. So now, if prices drop, you'll lose a lot of money. So it's a speculative. It's the site end of it has always been very speculative in terms of its values.
So for first-time buyers, the idea that there's vast tracts of land out there that they can build on. There's nothing in the private sector. Certainly, there's nothing that's going to be built on at those rates of increase. There's nobody going to keep the prices down for new builds. Nobody.
Well, I mean, in terms of the availability of land, there's enough zoned residential land in Ireland to build over 400,000 houses at the moment. So we don't need any more zoned land. There's enough zoned land in Dublin to build somewhere in the region of 45,000 houses. Local authorities actually own enough zoned land in Dublin in the 4 local authorities to build about 19,000 houses. So, you know, the real question is, for I suppose for anyone, is if you're sitting on an asset and if it's going up by 20 or 30% a year, are you going to sell it now? No.
No.
The other interesting thing is you're in a situation if it becomes the backing for a stock, then your stock value is based on the value of your land. Your land is worth more now vacant than for its potential future value.
Yes.
It would be if you build out now, you're crystallising your value.
You're cashing in.
Price. You're cashing in.
Yeah.
Whereas if you keep it vacant, it might go up by another 20 or 30% next year, and so on and so forth. And if you recall, Centrepoint in the UK was vacant for years.
Yes.
Because the guy who developed it had a mixed portfolio, was able to fund it, and it was more valuable for its potential future rent than for renting it out. So we had this bizarre situation where you have an asset and somebody is keeping it vacant. Why would you keep it vacant? Because it's bolstering up the share price of a different of a separate company. And we know now some of the heavyweights now who are in the market now are REITs who whose founder shares on the basis of these windfall. I mean, really, you're getting telephone numbers out of it. You know, 30, 40 million a year.
This is carpetbagging
on the basis of. Well, it's a speculative. But if you're taking your money off the table every year, and if it's your shareholders are very understanding about it, and it's all fine as long as the numbers keep going in the right direction. So as long as the new house price keeps going up, you're going to hit your 12 to 15% target a year. But it's when it doesn't happen what's going to happen to supply. So this is the same in Ireland as it is in the UK or in any other jurisdiction. You have a lot of big players saying in the UK the market is dominated by maybe 7 or 8 big builders who have very strong balance sheets, and they're buying land to build on in 7, 8 years' time.
So there's no real affordable housing in Ireland then, the way things are looking, that nobody's building affordable housing.
We never did affordable housing, even when we had, what we did was we had discounted through the Dublin City Councils or your local authorities or whatever it was, you had a discount, so the private developer built it out, and a certain tranche of that were sold. They had to go to get a mortgage, but they were given maybe 15%, 20% or whatever it was off the market price. That wasn't actually affordable housing, it was discounted housing. That was the scheme. To my eternal shame, I was heavily involved in many of them, but some of them, you know, these were people from certain areas who wanted to stay in certain areas and couldn't afford to stay in those areas, and this was a roadmap. But it wasn't actually affordable housing, it was purely a discounted policy.
Which doesn't work. Yeah, the discounted sales price doesn't work, and similarly the discounted rent doesn't work, because then you have people who are paying rents that are too high for them. I think the failure rate for the previous, I think you're referring to the affordable housing scheme from 2002 to 2011.
Yep.
I think something like 43% of people who bought houses under that scheme are in arrears, and it's cost the department an awful lot of money. It's something like 800 million so far. But the primary reason for that is the normal lending rules weren't applied, and you had people who were in careers that weren't great in terms of, might have been in construction like myself, were taking on loans that were too big. They were buying houses or apartments for 340,000 euros, and we know now the affordable level should be around 240. But I mean, the thing about the affordable housing is, what we've been talking about exclusively here is one type of building.
Yes.
Which is the only type of building we're doing here. But for years we did other types of building, and we did have affordable houses, and we had a market system here 30 years ago where one full-time salary could buy a house. Now you need a minimum of 2 full-time salaries, and in some areas it'd have to be very, very high salaries as well, or have significant injections of equity. So there isn't, the private sector works at a certain level, and for my mind, the private sector just can't. I think it's naive for policymakers to think that the private sector can deliver affordable housing. It can't. It just by its nature, and when you stack up the way that it works, it can't.
And you've just broken it down.
And we know as well that, for example, in Cherrywood and different places, number of places in South Dublin, that proposed social housing, which is going to be sold at discounted site value and at a 5 or 10% profit margin, is at between 340 and 360,000 euros. That's way over what an affordable house would be.
That's a politician's pay salary.
Well, I don't know which is it.
Yeah.
What politician?
Well,
Can I ever
that's
get
your
the job?
that's your
Can I get
that's your
Well,
entry
at
level.
3,500, your TD starts at 90.
I have my CV with me. Where can I get the application for it?
Actually,
So,
we're starting that campaign as soon as the pod is over.
So I mean, yeah. So the private sector cannot deliver affordable housing. It's pretty simple, but it's happened. And the interesting thing is, in the middle of all this sort of mess and policy fog and kickstarts and lack of expertise and all this, one company's actually done it. They've down the road from me here. They've literally just set up sticks and sold on houses, 2-bed houses for 150,000.
You're 2 kilometres from it.
There, yeah, and it's right. Anyone wants to go out to IKEA, you drive out and have a look, and they're really, they're nice looking houses. Obviously, not as nice as if I designed them. No offense to Joe Kennedy, the architect on it, but they're fine looking houses, and they're perfect, and they're
energy
efficient. They're A3 rated. They're good design. And I think when the ads for these went up in the paper, people thought they were messing around or taking the mick. And basically, the site was passed on to the co-op of Coulon, who did them for €1,000, which is half price. Sites at that stage were selling for 2,000 a site, and they got half their development levies, €4,000 knocked off. So the entire thing was privately financed.
So we're a little bit of good. Well, AIB, I think
AIB were the funders on it. So this is straight away in the middle of all this. You've got somebody's actually turned in and managed to develop a scheme which at really affordable levels. So using that model, if you got a site for €1,000 in Cherrywood, you could sell houses with today's build costs for 170,000. Nothing to stop you. You'd get them out quick. I'd get a Coulon out to Dunleary very fast.
But the alternative, and what is happening, one of the figures you've predicted is that in lieu of building affordable housing at costs that people can actually buy them, by 2021, the government's going to instead give $4 billion to private landlords through the HAP scheme.
Yeah, well, I mean, the numbers here are a bit scary when you start looking at them, because we have, I think if we look at the biggest, the sector that's growing at the fastest rate, housing sector, is actually the assisted rent supplement and state assisted housing. The HAP scheme is the Housing Assistance Payment Scheme, which was brought in a few years ago by Alan Kelly. In theory, it's very good. Both people can be working. It's on a sliding scale. So if you're entering into some form of rental distress, or if the market's getting away from you, you can apply for it and you can get part funded for it. The rates are pretty good as well. They're fairly generous, up to about, I think, €1,300 for a 2-bed in Dublin. They're less depending on locations.
I think the average is around €825.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I think the average cost per household is $8,250 a year, something like that.
No,
and that's a direct movement of money from the taxpayer to
private landlords.
Yeah. It's a wealth transfer.
It's a better system, but the only problem with it is that there's no. It's the only thing that we're looking at the moment, and we know if you do a really simple. I'd love somebody to do a more detailed cost benefit analysis on it, but I had a crack at one a couple of months ago. And I mean, we all know that renting. Talk to your granny, and they'll say to you, renting is dead money. That you'll have nothing at the end of it. Lord Conserve was in here a while ago, and he's talking about you need the asset to fund yourself. That's the way this society works here. You don't want to be renting when you're 65. You want to have a house under you, so you have some flexibility and you can fund yourself in your old age. If you're getting €1,000 on HAP, and you're living in a 2-bed apartment, the state can build that 2-bed apartment. We know it was confirmed last year for an all-in cost of about €191,000. So if you take a 200,000 build cost, including a nominal amount for your site, the repayments for the state on that, if they're to borrow at 3.5%,
which they can borrow at less, but
they
anyway,
can go sub-LIBOR for this stuff.
Yeah.
So would be about $800 a month. So straight away the state could build that and rent it to a HAP tenant for less, for €800.
Okay.
Now over 30 years, the state will own that. So the state will have an asset. If it was built to the passive standard or to a near zero energy standard, the 30-year saving is about €40,000 to the state. And even if the state was to turn around in 30 years and sell it on at half price, they're still 180,000 better off. So the cost for the state to rent, as far as I'm aware, nobody has done a cost benefit analysis of a rental, social rental versus social build, right? And the difference in cost is it's €270,000 more expensive over 30 years to the state for a rent supplement system than for a build system. And this is a massive cost to us. It's going to cost us, in Rebuilding Ireland, is somewhere in the region of about 30 or 40,000 new HAPs are planned.
Yeah.
And the cost is monumental. It's something like 1.9 or 2 billion. Now, the budget at the moment for the 5 or 6 different types of rent supplement, there's approximately over 100,000 people now on some form of rent assistance. HAP is increasing at 216 families per week. That's new families who've never experienced rent distress. That's 11,300. It's the biggest growing sector in housing at the moment. And it's outstripping our supply. So this is, if you're going in renting a 2-bed apartment in town, chances are 1 in 3 people looking at that will be availing of HAP and will be able to pay more for that. If you're in danger of entering the homeless system, I'm aware that they can vary the rates and you can get up to 1,700-1,800 a month for a 2-bed. So in some locations it would appear, and from anecdotal information I've got from agents, that the HAP system is actually inflating rents, because you have this feedback loop. And we know last year, out of the 300 exits, 4,000 people entered into the homeless system, 3,000 exited. 1,000 people were recycled back into the private rental sector with these turbocharged subsidies. So they're sort of feeding into this sort of cycle. So it's a tricky one. Now, we're spending 730 million a year on rent assistance. That's going up by 140. So in 2 years' time, we're going to be spending over €1 billion a year on subsidised rents. And the budget we know for the last 12 months on bills, acquisitions, Part 5, on actual the state obtaining physical houses, was 466. So we're going to be, in the UK, they're billed for, they 4 million people on rent assistance. Now they're much bigger than we are, they're 16 times their size, but they have, their bill is 500 million a week on rent assistance of some kind. That's 295 billion a year, and their budget for building and acquiring units is 5. So we're heading very close to that sort
model.
Of where every year our overall budget, where you get these headline figures of it's 1.4 billion this year, 1.8 next year. A decreasing proportion of that increase will be going towards capital spend. So and the current spend on rent assistance, which is really turbocharging the whole sector, is having a bigger and bigger chunk out of it.
Hi folks, given the amount we've covered and the following a lot of feedback from you, our listeners, we decided to cut this episode up into some smaller parts. The next part will be available shortly, but in the meantime, I want to thank you all for listening and remind you that you can subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Please take a minute and leave us a review, and don't forget to tell your friends. Keep an eye on the website echochamberpod.com, find all our previous podcasts and some new blogs. You can send us an email to theechochamberpod@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter @echochamberspod. Thanks again folks, we really do appreciate you listening.